All right, welcome to period 2 of the APUSH curriculum. We got through period 1. As we get out of period 1 and period 2, we're going to see our focus narrow. We went from sort of Native American civilizations and European civilizations, getting down to those European empires. We're going to see throughout this period of history, getting it ever down more narrower to just the British Empire, and that's eventually going to lead to the American Revolution in period 3. So for key concept 2.1.1, we have European colonial goals and their empires. All right, now this first one comes with a fair warning. It's going to be short, okay? And the reason for that is that a lot of the stuff in period 1, videos you've already watched and things we've already studied, focused on the Spanish Empire, and this is what this first slide is about. So we're just going to kind of breeze through this. I'll just mention a couple things to review and a couple things that I haven't mentioned before. Now, reference back to 1.2.2 and 1.2.3 for more details on this topic. This is just kind of a breeze through here. So, some of the main methods of both subjugation and incorporation. See if you remember, that main economic system looks like the word economic. Encomienda system, right? So tribute labor from the natives to fund Spain. Next, that hierarchy. See if you remember what it was called. That was the caste system. And sort of the overarching power that came from Europe, the Catholic Church. These work to both keep the natives sort of in line with Spanish goals, but also find ways to not make them too miserable so that there wasn't overt resistance as much. Remember what we'd studied before, that despite any sort of attempts at reconciliation, any attempts at cooperation, 90% of the natives would have still died out. But what we see happening for those that remain, they live separately from Spanish colonists, only dealing with those that had power in order to pay tribute through the encomienda system. And a little data here, so by 1650, there were about 350,000 peninsulares. Remember, they only accounted for a small percentage of the total population in the Americas. Most were still natives. All right, and just two new terms to separate how Spain administered their empire. First, the Viceroyalty of New Spain. You can see on the map there that this is going to be the upper part of their empire. And the Viceroyalty of Peru, which is representing a lot of what was in South America. All right, so moving right along, because we've already studied that stuff, we're looking at new stuff here that we haven't talked about too much, just kind of, brief mentions. First, talking about French colonization efforts. Now, what we're looking at here with both France and the Netherlands is what we call neo-colonialism, the idea of establishing kind of a new outpost of one's own country. Okay, so these often had more economic goals than they were looking at permanent settlements. So France is one of the last major European countries to colonization. So France had been undergoing some turmoil for some time with religion. Catholicism and Protestantism, you studied in AP Euro, weren't getting along well. That prevented them. So what we see is by the time that they get to the Americas, they're left with the least desirable parts. Canada's a great place, but in terms of resources and climate for growing the things that worked for an empire, it really wasn't what they were looking for. So what happened as a result? An economic-based empire that looked at what natural resources were available and building good relations with the natives. So France didn't go in trying to impose Catholicism on the natives. They didn't go in for conquest. They went in there to trade with the natives, often trading with them things they couldn't get in America for things that Europeans could not get back in Europe. A few terms to go along here. Fur traders. So one of the major things they were often hunting was fur. One of the major things that they were hunting were beaver pelts. Okay, so if you ever saw the movie The Revenant, they're always talking about these pelts and having to get these pelts, mostly in beaver. In fact, when they hunt these beaver and bring the pelts back to Europe, they're often made into hats. So beaver pelts have a lot of water resistance in it with their oils. So if you make a hat out of the same water resistant fur, then it's going to repel water as well and keep your head dry. Okay, the name for many of these fur traders was the coureur du bois. That means runner of the forest in French. So it means that they're going through the forest dealing with the natives, and some chose to stay there. And remember, because they had better relations with the natives, that resulted in some intermarriage as well. But there was a small French presence there compared to the Spanish Empire that we've studied before. All right, there was some missionary work, but it wasn't as sort of systematic as the Spanish were, right? So Spain was looking to go in and mass convert the natives. The French weren't looking to do that. There were some missionaries going into Indian tribes, villages, trying to expose them to Christianity, but not trying to force it upon them. So some chose to join, most did not, and we'll look at the British colonies later. So we're not saying much about France here moving forward. So something that's even more minor was the Netherlands, the Dutch attempts at colonialism. So let's talk about what's going on with the Netherlands for just a second. And what's going on was that the Netherlands had broken away from Spain and developed their own independent republic. And as part of breaking away, they also chose that they were no longer going to be tied to Catholicism as the Spanish crown was. So really, the Netherlands establishes itself as a secular country, and they hope to build themselves as a financial powerhouse in Europe, controlling many of the banks and lending houses that will hope to make returns on investments, especially in the Americas. Here's the thing, it wasn't that successful, so they failed to establish themselves there. The place where they do try to create forts and kind of follow the French system was in modern-day New York and Pennsylvania, what will be the middle colonies when we look at Britain later on. So the Dutch were the ones that bought Manhattan, though it's a whole sordid story I can tell you in class if you want to hear it. The way they worked it, they had trading posts like the French, they had forts. The difference was they did not have a good relationship with the natives. So they weren't willing to work with them, to trade with them. They saw it more as kind of this imbalance of power and status. The natives didn't like that. They liked working with the French much more. So what happens is eventually the Netherlands realized that they kind of had sunk costs. That's an economics term for accepting that even if you invest a bunch of money in something and it doesn't go well, you have to be willing to abandon it and move on. You have to accept your sunk costs. They did that. They sold off their claims mostly to Britain, and continued to focus on being that financial powerhouse in Europe with no real American presence. All right. This next one is going to be a little bit short too, not so much because we've already covered it, but having to do with the fact that we're going to cover it much more in later presentations. In fact, the presentation after this is going to be completely dedicated to all the different colonial regions within the British colonies. So this is going to be a bit of a breeze. All right, so the first introduction of British colonizers into the Americas was in 1607. In Virginia, where they established Jamestown. Now, there had been attempts at settlements before, so if you've heard of the lost colony of Roanoke, that was years before. They got lost, so to speak. People often view it as some sort of mystery in our history. The truth, as far as we can figure it out, is that most of them died out. You're going to see that's what happened with a lot of people at Jamestown as well. But rather than all dying out, they incorporated into the local Native American tribes, intermarried, and eventually, when people went there decades later, they seemed to have disappeared, but were really just living throughout the area, not in a concentrated way. All right, that was a bit of a tangent, but here we are. So a way to remember this, and I don't know, I'll bring it up maybe once in a while, but the Disney movie Pocahontas, the very first song in the movie is called The Virginia Company, and it says, "In 1607 we sailed the open seas for glory, God, and gold, and the Virginia Company." Okay? I guess that's how I know it, all the way since 3rd grade. There we are. What were they trying to do? Growing tobacco on plantations. Tobacco was a cash crop. It was something that did not grow well in Europe because the climate was not right and the soil was not fertile enough. Grew fantastically down in the southern, in how do I say this? I was about to say the southern United States. We're not there yet. But down where Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas are today. So if you've been there in the summer, you know it's hot and humid, good for growing tobacco. And also, now that there were Europeans addicted to the stuff back home, it was very profitable to grow it. So really, Jamestown started as one of these joint stock companies. The idea of invest in this and hope to make a return because it's in such huge demand back home. Most people that went over were young men. If you look at the data, which we have, there were very few families because people were going there to make money, to find, glory and gold. They didn't really find either. We'll get to that in a little bit, because they failed to find a reliable labor source. Now, they first tried to use Indian labor. We've already talked about those mutual misunderstandings between natives and Europeans. So there was the language barrier, different views on how the land should be used. The natives were just kind of like, we're good, we're not going to do this. So what filled that labor void instead are what we called indentured servants. This is the idea that poor, landless men from back in Europe would sign a contract in which someone else paid their passage to the New World. They would then work for typically 7 years of manual labor, at which point they would be set free to go do as they please within the Americas, hopefully to get land of their own and then get rich on their own. That never really filled the labor needs completely. Things changed later on. We'll get into this in a later slideshow. But because that context shifted, slavery, African slavery, replaced indentured servants for economic reasons because it was cheaper. And then also because there just wasn't a supply of indentured servants anymore either. All right, a little detail on Jamestown. So it's kind of right at a peak of this peninsula in the Chesapeake Bay, down in what's Virginia today. And you can see that image on the top right of what kind of a mock-up of what Jamestown looked like. It was built in that triangular fashion so they could have lookouts in all directions. Okay, it was also a good positioning for if they had to fight off the natives. This was an ideal kind of military setup. All right, now the problem for them, they struggled to survive. So they were going to this brand new world where they didn't know the land and they weren't growing things to eat. How stupid is that? They were so focused on growing tobacco to make a profit that it was often help from the natives that really helped them even to get along. So they weren't growing those three sisters. Remember, corn, beans, and squash. So what happened is you look at kind of the death rate within those past few years, you had like 80-90% of the Jamestown population dying out. More kept on coming over, partially because they were misled by the Virginia Company back in London. But eventually, I think it's maybe like 10-25 years down the line, they start to maintain their population and are more successful years later. But it was a struggle at first. Now, the other major colony you need to know about, which we'll talk a lot more about next time, is the New England colony. So all the mythical stuff about Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims, the Puritans. Here's just a brief kind of overview of what's going on with them. More details next time. So Puritans or Pilgrims, use either term. They work just as well. Puritans refers to their religion, which was the idea that they were trying to purify, I think that's the next one, purify their religion through kind of the pairing of their government with their religion. Puritans were not happy about how much religious leniency there was starting to be in England. They wanted very strict rules. They didn't want a plurality of religions, which is kind of funny in a way, because oftentimes the Pilgrims, if you ask someone, oh, why did they come to America? People will say, oh, they wanted to promote religious toleration. No. In a way, they were not looking to promote that. They wanted only their religion to be tolerated. So, which is kind of like the exact opposite of what you think. So, they were displeased. They created their own colony in what is today Massachusetts. And they copied some British systems with the government and things that seemed like home, but purifying it in a way that fit their needs rather than what was already going on in Britain at the time. Much more next time. All right, thanks for watching as always. There are your next steps. So keep on track, and I'll see you later.